Anyway, yeah, so last night, I don't know, you know me. You know that the bad habit that I have is that I will keep like 100 tabs open or whatever
Yeah.
for something that I'm working on. And then to make that problem even worse, I always operate in sort of like these days, especially where my browser is like it's disposable. So when I close it, it doesn't save any history, and it doesn't like if I reopen it, like those tabs don't come back. So last night we had the big storm, and I knew that this was not boding well for me, and I told my wife I need to go upstairs and shut down the computers, or at least unplug them, right?
Yeah.
And so I unplugged my work laptop, but then like I got to my personal work, and I was like, oh, I have to like figure out a way to like close all this stuff off. Because it's like all of these open tabs, like where I'm like doing research on like different problems that we're working through and stuff. And so I was like, I don't have time to do that right now. So like I'll just leave it here until after the boys are in bed, and then I'll come up and deal with it. Um, that was not enough time. And so I'm downstairs and I'm in the playroom with the kids, and the power starts to flicker. And I'm like, maybe it'll hold, but then gone. And so I lost a ton of work last night, not just like work, the output, but also like the inputs, right? All the research
Yep.
and stuff. And that's killing me this morning to the extent that I'm like, I mean, I don't even know where to start now because like, um, I don't know. There's probably some balance of like FOMO or whatever. Like I lost all those tabs, but like I seriously had like a section of tabs on like DigitalOcean Spaces and a section of tabs on all of the like different analytics platforms that we're kind of toying through right now and the different ways that folks have worked with them. And yeah, so what a bummer.
But I think
What a
there's
bummer.
a benefit to it too, though, right? Like, so it sucks in the moment. Oh man, I lost all this work, all this research. Because really, like solving problems, like the actual implementation probably takes, the least amount of time.
Right.
It's all the research that goes into it. But I think there's like a silver lining here is that you're going to come back and you're going to say, wait a minute, you're going to start to recall things, right? And so it's going to really test. And the bigger the bigger benefit here is now you can reevaluate and say, was that approach that was that path that I'm heading down or was heading down, is that still the right path?
Yeah.
I was doing that
Like,
the other day. So last night I was working on the clone feature for Propeller.
okay. Yeah.
Okay, I was like, oh, I got to create all these tickets, but they're all similar. I need to be able to clone them. I've got the ticket to clone. And it's all right. Last night I'm going to work on it. So I start working on it. I start getting all these alerts for like the storm coming in, tornado warning, all that stuff. And I'm like, okay, I'm at a pretty good spot. There's a storm coming in. There's a high likelihood that this machine is going to shut down in the middle of the
Yeah.
night. So I went ahead and I just pushed what I had. Like I just created a commit that says like, initial
There's a
implementation.
storm coming.
Yeah, hey, that's a great commit message. There's a storm coming. Push everything. So basically, commit message was something like initial implementation of clone feature, and I just pushed it up. I just committed everything. It didn't matter what state it was in. I pushed it
Yeah.
up. Because the great thing is, right, I can always reset when I bring it down,
Hmm.
if I want. But the thing too was I didn't want to lose it. However, here we are. We come back to today, and I'm starting to second guess myself. Is the approach that I was started taking even the right approach? Maybe I overcomplicated, and that's where I'm feeling this morning. So I have a much simpler approach to solving the problem. So again, a benefit to something that might initially appear like it's a problem or a blocker.
Yeah. I think the hardest part is remembering where I was. I didn't push my code, which is a great practice, first of all, push your code and get stuff off your local machine, which I'm like, as you're saying all of that, I'm thinking like, how can I get more of this off my local machine? Especially when I think about like the notes that I take around browsing. And I mean, we have Docusaurus, so I should probably just throw a cloud editor in there and start capturing my notes in Docusaurus so that I don't have to keep them locally. But then the other things, I think that's the hard part for me though, is like trying to remember where was I. um
Right.
Maybe that's my, I'm getting old.
No, it also that's a good call. That's a good call out, but um it kind of reiterates the fact that like if we iterate, right, and if we build small, then you can finish these small things up quicker,
Yeah.
and then you can push, right? So really small. We've talked about atomic commits in the past. Again, if you have 50 tabs open and you've got all this, maybe like I'm just saying that maybe you have like changes to 20 different files. Maybe the change to just too big, and you could have, broken it up, and you could have been pushing, and then
Yeah.
therefore you would have been building to a solution as opposed to trying to, waterfall it.
Yeah, and you know what I'm working on. I'm not ready to talk about it publicly here, but some big changes. So I was working not just in one, like I was working across multiple repos, which makes it even worse. Because I have like little changes everywhere to get stuff moving.
But
Yeah,
that's
definitely some reminders to follow some good advice that we've talked about in the past.
we got to follow our own advice sometimes, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So that's so. Yeah, we had a big storm last night. It's not really what we came here to talk about today. There was a really awesome topic that stemmed from last week's um session or episode that we did, and the idea of story and spectacle, or story versus spectacle, because they're not necessarily on opposite ends like their opponents. Sometimes they work really well together if they're done right, and I think there's a really cool parallel between, like story and spectacle in film and in like entertainment, along with like the industry that we're in, like building a business, tech startups, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I can't wait to unpack this topic with you. When you said that you wanted to kind of do a follow on here, I was really excited because I remember when you mentioned that dichotomy in the last episode, I was like, I wanted to hook into it and go into it right then, and I knew that wasn't the topic, so I'm excited to talk about it today. But for all of our listeners, I just want to reiterate what you started off with there, and that is that like there's not necessarily an opposition. I mean, you and I have been in the camp of choose it or lose it. And I don't know exactly what, like, I'm excited to hear from you, like what you consider spectacle in software. But I think that framing of juice it or lose it definitely has something to do with spectacle. And so I definitely want to make sure that like we ground our listeners in that we're not opposed to Flash or whatever. I mean, I might like not Flash,
Yeah.
the software development.
But like the juice, the
Yeah,
spectacle, right? That's what we're talking about. But when we're talking about like film, so first of all, kind of get like a grounding there. Usually when I think about story and spectacle, I think about film. I'm talking about like long form, or like the 2 hour film. You think about when we grew up, there's all these movies that we want to watch. And I talked about this last time, is I'm kind of coming back as a family and watching some of these movies that I grew up on. You mentioned the Goonies. We just got done watching the Back to the Future trilogy. My kids loved it. It was awesome, right? I mean, you look at the graphics, right? The spectacle that's in it, and for its time, it was pretty cutting edge, right? It was pretty advanced,
yeah,
right? You go back and look at it today, and you're like, oh man, those. But the thing is, you don't necessarily say that they were so bad, because they really did help to advance the storyline. Like they were needed,
yeah,
and that's kind of where I start to like draw the line. Like there's no hard line in the difference between story and spectacle. It's not like you can say, here's the line, when you see it, you've crossed over, right? Because a good filmmakers can cross over and you don't even know it, right? They kind of they blend story into spectacle, and spectacle becomes part of the story and helps to advance it. So first of all, with story, right? We're talking about like character creation. We're talking about moving you from, point A to Z, but along the way there are stops that help to advance the story, right? Help us to understand what's happening, where we started, and where we're going. Um, and I'm not like an expert writer or anything like that. I mean, at the very most, I took like a couple courses in college on like creative writing, so I do enjoy creative writing. I've never written a
yeah,
book, even though that's on the list for someday. But we're talking about story, right? We're talking about characters and um, character arcs. We're talking about development over time, right? And we can see very similar parallels with like not only tech startups, but just companies in general. There are characters, right? Who's, running the business, who's trying to start the business, who are the customers. All these kinds of things play into it. And then that's, the story part of it. And the spectacle is the flash, the visuals. But more so, when I think about spectacle, I think about more so over the top visuals, or visuals that are more than just what's required, right? Because if we think
yeah,
about the original stories, like when I say the original stories, I'm talking about like think about early movies. It was
Like very
just
early.
very early movies. It was just what you saw. Like it was
Hmm.
people in front of a camera moving from here to there. And over time, we started to introduce stuff that help us to escape more. Because that's really important too, right? Understanding the reason for film, the
Yeah.
reason for stories. It's an escape, right? It's there's some directors that I've listened to, and you know, and story and writers, and the idea of a story, right? The whole intention of a story of a film is to take you to transport you somewhere for those 2 hours or for that book, right? For the
Yeah.
duration of the book. That's the intention.
Yeah. Or like, I mean, I have two things that I want to highlight. I'm not first a film critic, but the thing that I was thinking about as you were telling all of that is Wally. I love Wally as a movie, especially when you talk about like character building and spectacle. And like, I mean, Wally is a great movie to me in that like the first, I don't know how long it is, but there's no words at all in the first like half of the movie or whatever. It's just Wally on this desolate planet doing like sort of mundane things. And there's some goofiness, but like that's all just like
Right.
kind of grinding you or grounding you in Wally's story. And like the thing that when I think of spectacle in that movie, I think about the moment that Wally leaves Earth. He breaks through that like array of satellites, the
It's like
space
debris, right?
trash.
Yeah.
Yeah, space trash. And then like it pans out and you see like it goes from the brown of Earth to the black of like space with the little stars. And I think about that as like a, the spectacle, and that was an important translation. Um and like so I, just finding that balance and using spectacle to tell a story, because I think like what you get there is like this very grounded robot in the vastness of space, right? He's totally out of his element. The other thing that like really stuck out to me is when you mentioned like every startup has a story, and like I think that's really important to hone in on just for a moment. I know we're not going to talk about story. I love story. I'm not really into film, but I'm into film. I'm not a film critic like in the same way that you are, but I do love story. And I think about like the value of a narrative for a startup or for a company in the way that that can create cohesion. Like, because you mentioned transportation is one reason for narrative, but the other one is to like define your tribe, right? Create cohesion. Like when you think of like the narrative history of the human species, like we tell these stories of us as a tribe. And that's one thing to think about, is the way that that can bring cohesion to the people building the thing. And the other one that I think about though is like being very careful about where you create your conflict, because like every good story has some conflict, right?
Yep.
And the last thing you want to do as a company is create your conflict in the wrong place and start fighting the wrong battle. um like this is just like, I know this isn't where we're going with this, but I just think about the idea of like making your customers the conflict or gaining customers being the
Yeah.
conflict. And that means that you begin to put yourself in opposition to your customers, and so they can't be a part of your tribe.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you have an example of where a company has made their customers, the conflict?
Do I have an example like off the top of my head? I don't think so. I think I've known of places where customer acquisition has been the conflict.
Well, the one that comes to mind is Domino's, right? Ben is the one that kind of brought that to light for me,
Yeah.
right? It was around, surrounding like accessibility. There's a lot more to the story, and we'll have to have Ben. We really need to have Ben on to talk about it and other things. But Domino's, and again, not an early company, but
Right.
they're
This is a great example.
but it doesn't really matter because companies continue to tell the story, right? They continue to define the narrative all the way until they're no longer a company, and even afterwards, until after they go out of business. But Domino's made they created a conflict with their
With
customers.
Yeah, absolutely they did. I think that's really great to call out. Is that and yeah, I think Ben's local expert on that entire conflict. And I also like that you called out that like you don't have to be a new business to do this, right? Like in essence, whenever you see like these companies and they have like established in some year, right? The older that year is, they're telling a story just with that one little line. They're saying like, we've been around the block, right? We have some stories to tell. Just like the same way that when I know we both feel very similarly about years of experience, but like when you hear somebody say like 20 years of experience, they're telling a story with that. They're basically saying, I've been around the block. I'm battle hardened. I've been through some fights. But I think the key there is to know who are you fighting and what are you fighting against? Because certainly don't make it your customers. Don't fight with your customers.
Yeah.
They need to be a part of the tribe, right? They need to be part of the cohesive group that is share of that shared narrative. So that was the other thing that sort of stood out to me as you're talking about that
You
a
know when
little bit
you
earlier.
you know when you said the year that a whole established in, it's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
the beginning of a book or a beginning of a movie where it'll tell you like 1981, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of establishes the scene, right? The setting, like this is where the story begins.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. This is where the story begins. Like it's 1981. I know it's not an old movie, but I love Super 8 and how like it does exactly that. Super 8's
yep,
sort of like a modern ET slash Goonies sort of film, very much in that vein. And
right,
like it starts off exactly like that though, is it's like here's the year.
exactly. So story and spectacle. There's one that I wanted to. There's kind of a there's something in there that I have to talk about, and that is when there's not enough story, or there's a story that isn't so pure that we hide it with spectacle, right? Or we compensate with spectacle. So first, let me talk about it with film, and then I have a specific example when we're talking about like a tech startup.
Okay.
But there's many, right? So if we're talking about like films, sometimes films just like the story isn't so great, and so we blow everything up in the movie, right? And we're like, oh, everything blows up, it's awesome, and we're just there to see massive. Like my son loves Pacific Rim, right? It's about these
Okay.
robots that fight these like monsters that come from out of, and then they end up coming from like this rift through the ocean. It's more spectacle than it is story, to be
Yeah.
honest, right? And that's what it is. Like you can watch the movie and you're like, the story is pretty lean,
Hmm.
but that's probably not why we're watching the movie anyway, right? This is a movie
Right.
that relies heavily on spectacle. Another one that I can think of is, and I hate to put this one in there, but I'm going to because I was actually a little let down because of it. So like Man of Steel is a movie that I was kind of like looking forward to for a long time. I was like, Man of Steel is going to be awesome. The trailers were awesome. Whoever did the trailers,
Yeah.
that person should have.
The
But the trailers were awesome. I remember this.
trailers were all of the story.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great call out because that's happens in many cases. The trailers are better than the actual movie. So
Yeah.
you go to see the movie, and there's parts of it that are good, and I just kind of felt let down. And there were parts where it was just, hey, we're weak on story kind of thing. Maybe not that obvious, but here's everything blowing up, right? This massive city is blowing up. Everything's just blowing up. And I understand like it helps us to understand the gravity of the situation, the power of these characters, right? That these characters are, superhuman. But it was almost like compensating for a thin story, right? Or a regurgitated story. So if we're drawing parallels, right, and I think there's a huge parallel here. Do you remember Theranos,
Yeah.
Elizabeth
Yeah.
Holmes, right? Think
Hmm.
about think about that story, about that narrative. They were going to, in like this little small amount of capsule, they were going to be able to draw like this small amount of blood. So no longer were we going to have to draw huge amounts of blood to be able to run tests and to be able to get like important information from them. Right. And that was the whole thing. And she even had like this little image up. She had this like poster up, and there's like a whole documentary on it and everything. But
Yeah.
what it did was it's almost like, when I say she, the company, the people that were in charge, her and anybody that was in charge, they used spectacle to cover up that the story
Yeah.
was very lean, it was very thin. They weren't really solving a problem.
Right.
They were pretending to solve a problem, and they were covering it up with spectacle, right? With news conferences, with billboards, with like all this hype, but
With a
they did it
promise,
with a promise, exactly. And that
like a
promise,
really attractive promise, right? Like,
yep.
and the reason I feel like, sorry to interrupt, but I feel like
Oh,
calling
go
that
for it.
out is because like I think that's the start thing that when as a company, when you're thinking about like what is my spectacle, think about what you're promising your user. And is that realized, or is it big? Is it are you promising something bold to get attention, or are you promising something bold because that's what you're delivering?
That's what it comes down to. I mean, if we're like gonna just strip back all the layers, it comes back to a promise. Is that promise, the big pie in the sky, or is it something that we can actually deliver?
Yeah.
And I think there is, for most companies, it makes sense to say, I'm going to start really small and I'm going to promise to do this thing and I'm going to give you this thing, right? So if we're using like a restaurant, I promise to provide a meal in exchange for money, right? It's very, very simple.
Yeah.
It's a promise and it can be realized, in a like a almost a synchronous exchange, right? You can
Hmm.
almost go up to a window and you can put your money and you can get your food, and the promise has been realized and you provided value.
Yeah.
And then there's other companies, right? And I'm going to use SpaceX here. We know that SpaceX just had a launch, right?
Yeah.
They launched the Starship and it exploded. Here's though a company that is leveraging spectacle to tell their story, because I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think that SpaceX is one of those companies that's trying to fool you, because I think that they're actually doing something, right? They're simply saying, we want to give you this thing, the big pie in the sky, but we're actually taking steps to do it, as
Yeah.
opposed to with Theranos was like, we're going to give you this awesome, we have this awesome promise, but we're really not doing what it's required to deliver. We're just going to take your money.
Right. Right.
So huge
If
difference
if
there.
if anything, SpaceX is teaching us that rocket science is hard, and that so is estimating time frames, because I think they've missed like every one of their time frames for, but they've eventually delivered. And yeah, I think that's really like that's a really fair contrast uh in between those two, because SpaceX is, they have promised us some. I mean, I think like in a time where, I don't know if you remember when we were kids, like NASA was everything,
Yep.
and going to space, like we had, I mean, I don't know, I sort of was born right out of the space race. So were you. Like we had just finished going to the moon. It was still like a novel opportunity. We were regularly going to space and space shuttles were a big deal. And then all of that dried up and went away for almost 20 years. And so like, I think something that's benefit that SpaceX benefits from is that that whole generation is now, we're all adults, and we still revel in sort of like a fascination with space,
Well, don't
and they're
forget.
bringing it back.
Yeah, well, don't forget, right? When NASA was huge and actually doing these things, we had all of the film and stories to go along with it, right? We had
Hmm.
Star Trek, Star Wars. There was a show that this other guy I knew used to watch, like Babylon something,
Babylon
right?
5,
Yeah, and
Battlestar Galactica.
there was like all these things, right, that went along with that. We were, here's NASA, a government funded agency, basically, that's promising to do this thing or attempting to do this thing, and we have all these stories, right, that were being told, like, hey, and so you start to build up like expectations, like, hey,
Yeah.
this thing's going to be a realization right here real soon, and many other things were realized, right? We have cell phones. I think we saw like cell phones, like in Star Trek, they used to have these little flip phones out,
Yeah.
right? Remember that? This was before cell phones were out, and here we are, and then you have this company, SpaceX, that's telling a story that kind of resembles something that we saw, as part of our childhood, right? These films, somebody daring to do this thing. The promise is big, but when you have somebody and that goes back to like narrative and characters, right? You have in books and stories, you have this wide variety of characters, and you
Yeah.
have supporting characters, and you have like lead characters. And when you have confidence that the lead character can do this thing, right? Can overcome because of the will, or because maybe they're so tough because of the things that they went through
Yeah.
in their backstory, that you have confidence that they can overcome and do these things and push through, then it helps to make the story believable.
Yeah.
And then
I think.
spectacle is not necessarily this shiny cover, right? Like this shiny movie poster, but it's something that we can actually get to.
Yeah, I think there's two things there to kind of like, I'm going to talk about Mark Watney because he sort of sits in this vein. Mark Watney is the main character in The
Yep.
Martian.
Yeah, I love that movie.
Um, you have a lot of confidence in his ability to do the thing, mostly because he has a lot of confidence that he can do the thing. Like this is
Yep.
an indefatigable character. Like he just really, I love that movie too. It's, I'll tell you that it's like comfort food for me. Like if I've had if I'm really tired or I'm sick, like I'll just put on The Martian and watch it. because there's something that uh is very rewarding about watching a person work problem after problem and just be resilient against those problems. And eventually, of course, because of that, they make it through the story and you have a lot of trust in them. Like the thing about that movie is really, it's really great. You mentioned like main characters and trusting them. It's like you almost trust him from the first problem, and almost entirely because he trusts himself. Like nothing that they've shown you says like, oh yeah, I can trust this guy. He can survive on Mars for 2 years, except that he's like, I can survive on Mars for 2 years. I'm a botanist. Like as if like that makes it like that's not like the combination that you would think of. That's one part of it. And like I love that story specifically because it doesn't really, I mean, certainly in some way it does suffer this problem. The next part of this that I thought about as you're talking through that, and the other place that spectacle comes from, and that's plot armor. Like where the main character, in every good story has conflict, and so like the main character of every story gets beat up.
Yep.
Like the main character of every story gets beat up, right? Like they get beat down and they have to lose a lot because you have to lose a lot to make winning worth it, right? But they never lose the critical fights. Like I think about like, you mentioned Man of Steel, and that's true. And then also like, the what's the very last one in the Dark Knight trilogy? Is it called The Dark Knight? The Dark
Yeah.
Knight Rises.
The Dark Knight Rises. Yep.
Yeah, and so like this like they have to show Batman bruised and broken and like beat up, and so that his rise means something, right? But like you also have like the stormtrooper problem where stormtroopers can never hit the main characters.
Right. They're
Like
supposed to be
that's
like expert sharpshooters or something.
right. But they can never hit the main characters because the main characters have plot armor. And so like making sure that like the narratives that we tell, one, don't like, and I think this is really at the core of why story matters, because story doesn't have to be about being invincible. And in fact, most good stories aren't about being invincible. They're about coming back. And like how you like that's the thing that builds confidence, the ability to come back over and over again. Mark Watney blows himself up, he blows up his hab, and he keeps coming back and he's like, I can figure it out, I can figure it out, I can figure it out. And like honestly, every one of those failures and his willingness to get back up from that failure and say like, I'm not out yet, that's what builds your confidence in him, is that he says, I'm not out yet. And I think that's a really important like part of that narrative. And but it also lends itself to spectacle, because some of the most spectacle comes from plot armor, like running through a hell of gunfire or whatever and not getting hit. Like it's completely unrealistic, and it's done to tell a specific kind of story about a specific kind of person that like almost unmoors us from the realities we live in.
Yeah, I think those are really good call outs. I think the one that you mentioned with plot armor is probably one of the most frustrating to me. You're right. It's funny. My two kids are really into Star Wars, but my oldest one, he can basically tell you
Mm-hmm.
like what happened from, I don't know, from the beginning of Star Wars, whatever that was, to the end. He can tell you all the characters and where they were at this point in time and when this was going and all that stuff. And he's even mentioned that too. He's like, and he's only 13, but I think he mentioned that younger. He was like, no, these stormtroopers, they're supposed to be excellent. Like they're highly trained, but then you get to the main characters, they can shoot everybody else,
Yeah.
but the main characters just somehow, you know, can like survive it, and they don't just survive it, but they don't get hit. And that's really frustrating. When you look at coming back to SpaceX, and I'm not gonna like say that SpaceX is like the greatest company. I don't know. But I think they're a good example, right? This Starship, I think it was called Starship, it
Mm-hmm.
it had a successful launch, right? It got off the ground and all that great stuff, and it exploded
Right.
minutes after. So you could
Right.
look at that as, hey, they're down but not out, right? Because the truth is, they're going to take all the data that they're going to take all their findings from that launch. They don't view it as a failure, right? It's simply a test. We're just
Right.
testing things.
Right.
We test in production kind of thing, and they're going to make it better, and they're going to solve the problem, right? You think about like Rocky, he got knocked down, and then he learned how his opponent fights, right? And then he was able to overcome. And again, you're absolutely right. It makes the victories worth it. It makes them like feel like they were earned, right? They're hard earned.
Right.
And so when you have victories that aren't hard earned, it's hard to get behind those characters, right? And there are, you know, different startup, not just startups, but companies in general that you feel like, man, that doesn't feel like it was hard earned, right? You can't really get behind their story.
Yeah.
But when you can get behind their story, right, you can support them. And I think about like mom and pop, you know, companies. So like locally owned companies, you go into a locally owned company and you go in there, you're like, you're from the neighborhood, you know, I can relate to you. You're solving a problem that is also my problem, you know, and they can tell you about their struggles, right? Last month, maybe they barely made payroll, right? And you can relate and you can root for them, right? Because
Yeah.
ultimately you're rooting for these players in the game.
I love this because it kind of brings us all the way back to like story and spectacle, right? Like I'm going to talk about like those magnificent golden arches. You've mentioned
Yeah.
McDonald's in the past, and like, man, like those golden arches, they stand for something. They're a symbol. Like that to me is like a kind of spectacle all on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're driving down the dark interstate and you see those magnificent golden arches, right? When I was a kid, I grew up in a really small town, a town of 9,000. Shout out Lovington, New Mexico. And we did not have a McDonald's. We didn't have a Burger King. Honestly, we didn't even really have a burger joint. We had this little bitty place that was probably straight out of the 50s and 60s. Like if you've ever watched the movie The Founder and how McDonald's was like way back in the day where you walked up to a window and you placed your order
Yep.
and like there was no place to sit. Like that was the place that like everybody went to for burgers. It was called Burger Builders. It was right by a park. You knew you were going to get your burgers at Burger Builders and go to the park and eat because there was no place to sit. And when I was in middle school, McDonald's came to town and Burger King came to town, right across the street from each other, right down the street from Burger Builders. And it was a big deal, man. I remember it being a huge deal. Everybody was so excited about McDonald's and Burger King being, I'll tell you, I don't know how long it took, but 20 years later, McDonald's and Burger King aren't there anymore. But Burger Builders is now a full scale like diner. Like they didn't get beat by them. They like expanded.
Wow.
And like I think that's a story, you know, like that's now like there was no spectacle, there's no golden arches for Burger Boy. It's just this little bitty place that's there that's been in the community for years and years and years. And like it, you know, it beats the big guys. And that's you know, that's sort of like the facing your giants kind of story that you know, people we love those stories. We like get behind them and you know, it's kind of like the GameStop saga that happened
Yep.
uh you know, like it's exactly like that. And that's really what it does, right? It's like that's not spectacle, this is just story, and then everybody latches onto it, right? Everybody latches onto it, and so like it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like GameStop's not going down because now you have all of these people that are like, GameStop's not going down, I'm backing GameStop against, I don't even know what the story was, to be honest with you. I think somebody like shorted their stock, and so a whole bunch of people bought their stock to drive it up and make that company lose a bunch of money. I honestly have no idea. So somebody out there knows better than me exactly what happened. The point is that everybody latched on to a story and they made that story happen. And yeah, and so like I guess GameStop's still around. And so maybe it worked out for them.
Yeah, I think we're always looking for something to get behind, you know.
Yeah.
I love that you called out like the idea of like fighting the giant, you know,
Yeah.
fighting giants. And a lot of this happens when like Walmart comes to a new town, right?
Yeah.
It's basically it happens like almost every town that they go into tends to happen these days, right? But I wanted to, you know, ask like maybe like a more personal question is if you think about Anvil's narrative or story, you
Yeah.
know, what does that sound like?
Yeah, I think at its core, like the core of Anvil, which we've talked about a couple of times, but like in the story, I think it's the story of um a few people that you know, like that I think what I've said in the past is like I want to get it to a place in my life now where I'm just building cool things with cool people. like let's make building fun again. Like it's like it should be like playing with Legos, right? And so that's not really an external promise though. and it's not really a narrative for like folks that are watching this unless they're like really just rooting for us to make it. um but at its core, that's like what drives Anvil, is like, I want to get folks together that are passionate about, and I think the thing that I'm not saying there, but is a real important part of that story, is to make the thing that we are passionate about the thing that we are doing with our time. Because like we talk a lot about like spending money, but not a lot about spending time. And we spend our time. And frankly, I think time is the more expensive resource because I can't make any more of it. I can't make any more time. And so like when I think about the narrative of Anvil internally, like what is it that we are striving to do, is we are trying to build things with a close-knit group of people, an actual community, in such a way that it allows us to spend our time together and do something for us, and then to do something for our families, right? Like, because that's the other part of this, is like, I like you, Ram, and I like Lewis, and if I got to choose between spending my whole day with Ram and Lewis or my whole day with Steph and Stephen and Jonathan, like they win every time. And I know you know that, we've talked about that a few times. And so like that's really at its core, that's like the external Anvil. And I think actually this is a great question, and it leaves me a little challenged, because as you know, we really haven't found our problem yet, right? We haven't found the thing that we feel is like, this is the thing for us to solve to, that fulfills that whole bit. And I think that's okay in one sense, but it means that like for an external narrative, for people like watching what we're doing and that want to garner interest in what they're doing, it means that they're kind of stuck, because it means they're really, the only thing for them to be invested in is us. We don't have a thing to show them, right? Like there's there's the story where the conflict takes place and we find the big problem and we solve it. Like that doesn't exist for an external audience yet, unless everybody is really, really invested in figuring out like, how are Ram and Randy and Lewis going to build a company. And we've had some challenges along that way for sure, because we've had lots of fits and starts, lots of things that looked like good ideas, but end up being mirages in what is a desert, or they don't stick the way we want them to. And so I think that's a really great and challenging question. What I think is trapped in that, though, is kind of coming back to it, is what I hope folks hear there is a real story, and there's no plot armor, and there's no I mean, we're pretty stripped away. This is we don't really have any even spectacle at this point. Like I think our story is probably a Cormac McCarthy novel, where we're trying to tread through a dead world. But I think I'd love to hear from you what you think the answer to that is as well. And like I think that there are, again, two stories there, and maybe that's in absentia of the other one, is that really the story that we're talking about now is us.
Well, I think you said it. I think you said it, and you just either didn't realize it, or you just maybe didn't want to share it. But I will, because I think it's really important, and I think we have found our problem, or at least part of it, and that's killing the 9 to 5.
Yeah.
You said it. If you have to choose between, whether it's me, Lewis, 10 other people, your family is going to win every time, and they should.
Yeah.
Right. Which means that finding or building something that allows you to spend more time with your family is the problem. Right. And it might not seem like a problem, because it might be like, well, we have to build a company in order for that to happen. Right. We have to build and sell something in order for that to happen. But I think that there's a way to do this, and something we hadn't actually talked about in a while, and that's fund. Right? Because we don't want to necessarily just solve the 9 to 5 problem for ourselves. We want to solve it for other people that have skills, right? Other people that want to do something similar. Again, we haven't talked about fund a whole lot on here, and it's something that we're going to, is in our bag of things to build, things to do.
Well, it's built. It's even running in progress.
Yeah, that's true. But it solves this problem, which I think is the big problem, right? Is the problem of like our time. which is how do we get away from working 9 to 5? And now there's like others, people and stuff that are kind of working on this. Like there's countries that are saying, hey, let's try out a 4-day work week, right? But we're
Hmm.
not even saying that. We're saying, how about we do the work when we want to do it, and we pick up the type of work that we want to do, right? And that's fun. Without
Yeah.
going into too much detail about it, I think that's the problem that we're solving.
Yeah, that's a really great one to call out. You mentioned that we haven't talked about fund on here in a while. Fund's a great example of like a story that I haven't revisited. I had sort of forgotten that it was in our portfolio of things that we've made. I mean, and we never really talked about it on here. We definitely didn't do like an official launch. Uh, we finished it and then immediately moved on to other things. And so I definitely think it's worth looking back at, because you're absolutely right. It's very strongly aligned with the problem that we're trying to solve of how do I, because I think like fun, like I don't want to go into it too deeply, but it goes into more of not just like, being able to spend your time, but also allowing people to answer the question more directly, how much do I need? And like, I can work enough to get that. And I can choose the way in which I work to get those things, in order to just like, I'm really just I'm living the life that I want to. That seems like a too big of a promise. That feels a little spectacle. Um,
Yeah.
but like, we're trying to create a means for people to live the life that they want, and to be really intentional about it. Um, and and know their trade-offs, because I think the thing, man, that nobody told me 20 years ago or more, when I first entered the workforce, was um how much of you it takes. Like nobody really talks about that part, and I didn't really see it from, I mean, I knew it from my dad. My dad worked really, really hard. It's one of the things that I'm proud to have like got to experience, but at the same time not, like, there's a trade-off there. But my dad would leave for work before we woke up, and sometimes get home long after we'd gone to bed. um and like, I mean, nobody sits down and says like, if you don't watch it, your work will take all of you. um, and I think that's something that maybe fund can help with.
100%. I think I in some of the videos that I just started creating, and there's something that's kind of like really big that I think I enjoy calling out, and I usually try to do it in a comedic way, but it's absolutely true. I'll usually say that you start doing this thing, stuff happens, and then you die,
Yeah.
right? So it's, what do you do in that time before you get over here? And I think that as you get older, it becomes more and more apparent that you're closer to this part than you
Yeah.
are to the beginning part. As a youngster, in your like 20s and stuff, you're just like, I got my whole life, I got forever. And you start to get over here somewhere and you're like, holy crap, I can kind of start to see where this thing ends, right? And you start to realize that your time is not yours. And if I were to say, this is the narrative of Anvil, it's, or I'll put it like this: Anvil's mission is to kill the 9 to 5.
Yeah. Yeah. Give people their time back. Yeah. I like it.